I found the recording on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 6 weeks before my wedding. It was not hidden. That was the thing that stayed with me longest in the weeks that followed. Not that he had said what he said, but that he had said it somewhere he believed was private but had not bothered to make actually private, which told me something about how much he believed I was paying attention. He was not wrong that I had not been paying attention. I had been in love. Love, in my experience, operates as a specific kind of tunnel vision. It does not make you stupid, but it redirects the analytical capacity that you would normally point outward and turns it inward, toward the relationship, toward the maintenance and the tending and the daily attention of building something with another person. I am good at analysis. I have always been good at analysis. I had simply been pointing it in the wrong direction. The recording was on the shared laptop. An audio file in a folder I had opened by accident looking for a document of mine. 12 minutes and 43 seconds. His voice, and another voice I recognized as his friend Tom, in a conversation that had taken place, based on the timestamp, 4 months ago. I put in my earphones. I listened to all 12 minutes and 43 seconds. His voice, at the 7-minute mark, saying, "The trust fund activates at 30. She turns 30 in March. We just need to get through the wedding and then the first year and then the activation, and by 18 months and I'll have joint access. Her parents' solicitor is old. He won't look too closely at the documentation if it comes from a husband." I took out my earphones. I sat at the kitchen table in the apartment we shared, the apartment I was paying for, which I had not thought about as relevant information until this moment, and I looked at the wall for a long time. My name is Grace. I was 29 years old. I was 6 weeks from marrying a man named Oliver, who had been my partner for 2 years and my fiancé for 6 months, and who had, it now emerged, been calculating the activation date of my trust fund since before we met. I was not going to marry him. But I was also not going to let him know I wasn't. Not yet. My father established the trust when I was 7 years old. He was a careful man, an engineer by training and by temperament, which meant he approached everything, including the financial protection of his daughter, with the methodical precision of someone who thinks about failure modes before designing the system. The trust contained the significant portion of what he had built over 30 years, a software company he had founded in the 90s and sold in the early 2000s for a number that had surprised even him. He had invested the proceeds conservatively and well, and by the time I was old enough to understand what I would inherit, the number had grown to something that required specific management. The activation condition was 30. His reasoning, which he had explained to me when I was 22 with the gentle directness of a father who believes his children deserve honesty about the systems that will govern their lives, was this: 25 was too young, 35 was too long to wait, and 30 was the age at which he believed most people had developed the judgment to manage significant assets without being managed by them. He had seen what early inheritance did to people. He was trying to protect me from that. He had not anticipated the specific failure mode of a man who would calculate the activation date from outside and arrange himself accordingly. My parents knew the broad shape of the trust. Its existence was not a secret. My father believed in transparency about these things, but the specific details were not publicly available. You would need to be paying close attention, or have access to specific professional sources, to know when the activation date was. Oliver had been paying close attention. I understood this in full about 40 minutes after the kitchen table, when I had moved from the first stage of receiving the information, the stillness, the specific silence of the world reorganizing itself, into the second stage, which was reconstruction. The detailed assembly of everything I now understood differently. We had met at a gallery opening. I had been there with a colleague. He had approached me, which I had found charming, because I was not usually the person who was approached first, and the specificity of his approach had felt like being seen. It had been, just not in the way I thought. I want to be accurate about Oliver because accuracy matters more to me than the story that would be easier to tell. He was not entirely a performance. This is the complicated truth of it. The men who do these things are sometimes entire fabrications, constructed personalities, borrowed histories, costumes worn for the duration of a scheme. Oliver was not that. He was himself, his actual personality, his genuine humor, his real preferences and habits, and the ways he was actually charming rather than performing charm. What he had done was deploy his real self in service of a calculated purpose. The connection was genuine. The direction of the connection was strategic. I had fallen in love with a real person who was also using me. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the coexistence of them was the specific, complicated grief that sat underneath the practical responses I began making within the hour of the kitchen table. He was 32, worked in finance, trading at a bank, A job he was genuinely good at and genuinely enjoyed. He was funny in the specific dry way that takes practice to appreciate and that I had appreciated immediately, which had seemed like a sign of compatibility and now seemed like evidence of successful targeting. He had been introduced to my social world with the specific ease of someone who had done their research. He knew which events to attend, who to befriend, how to position himself. I thought about the friend who had introduced us. Her name was Lily. She and Oliver had been at university together. She had, at the time, seemed like a happy coincidence, a friend who had a friend who happened to be available and interesting and there. I made a note to think about Lily more carefully. I did not change anything in the first week. This was harder than it sounds. I came home to him every evening and had dinner with him and watched television beside him on the sofa and answered when he spoke and initiated conversation and laughed when the things he said were genuinely funny, which they sometimes still were, because the humor was real even if the context was not. Above our relationship, invisible to both of us, the specific weight of what I knew now pressed against everything. I was also, in the first week, doing other things. I called my father on Thursday, 4 days after the kitchen table. Not to tell him what I had found, not yet, not by phone. I told him I wanted to review the trust documentation with him, that I had some questions about the activation process. He was pleased that I was thinking about it. We arranged to meet the following weekend. I called a lawyer on Friday. My own, not the family's solicitor, who was old and whom Oliver had described as someone who wouldn't look too closely. My own, specifically chosen for this purpose, specifically chosen for being thorough. Her name was Ms. Reeves. She was 44, direct, and the first thing she said when I described the situation was, "Do you still have the recording?" "Yes," I said, "I have the recording." "Good," she said, "don't touch it. I'll send you instructions for preserving it properly." She sent the instructions within the hour. I followed them exactly. I also, in the first week, began to pay attention in the specific way I should have been paying attention for 2 years, to everything. To what Oliver said and what he did and who he spoke to and what was said at the edges of those conversations that I had previously processed as background and now understood as data. I was, finally, pointing my analytical capacity in the right direction. The recording was the first piece. It was not the only one. In the 2 weeks following my discovery, with the focus of someone who has had the scales removed from their eyes and can now see the previously invisible infrastructure of a situation, I found the others. Oliver's friendship with Tom, who had spoken with him in the recording, was older and more strategic than I had understood. Tom worked in estate planning. He had, I found through careful and entirely legitimate research, a professional specialty in trust structures and beneficiary access mechanisms. He had been, I understood now, the professional resource behind what Oliver was planning. The documentation Oliver had been preparing, which I found in a cloud folder that he had not thought to password protect separately from the shared account we had set up for household admin, was a partial draft of what appeared to be a proposal for joint financial management. The language was careful, the framing was marital partnership. The practical effect, if implemented, would have been exactly what he had described to Tom: joint access to the trust once it activated. He had been preparing this for 8 months. I photographed everything. I sent the photographs to Ms. Reeves. She called me the following morning. "You have enough," she said. "Enough for what?" I said. "For whatever you decide to do," she said. "The question is what you want to do." I had been thinking about this question for 2 weeks. "I want him to understand, completely and publicly, what he did," I said. "I want the people around us to understand it. I want it to be documented. And then I want him gone, with nothing, and with no ability to claim anything connected to me or the trust." A pause. "That's achievable," she said. "The public element requires some care. What specifically are you thinking?" I told her what I was thinking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's very precise." "I'm an analyst," I said. "Precision is what I do." I had been thinking carefully about Lily since the first week. Lily had introduced us. That was the fact. What that fact meant, whether she had known, whether she had been complicit, whether she had simply been used as unwitting infrastructure, was what I needed to understand before I decided anything about her. I had known Lily for 6 years. She was warm, occasionally oblivious in the way of people who are primarily focused on their own interior landscape, and fundamentally decent in the ways that had always mattered when it counted. She had been at my grandmother's funeral. She had helped me through a difficult period at work 3 years ago with the consistent, unglamorous presence of someone who simply shows up. I met her for coffee on a Tuesday. I did not tell her what I knew. I asked questions about Oliver, careful, casually framed questions that someone who was simply interested in learning more about her partner's old friend might ask. What came back was more useful than I expected. Lily, it emerged, had not known about the trust. She had known Oliver was interested in meeting someone serious, and had thought of me, and the introduction had seemed natural, and she had been pleased when things had developed, and she had not known. She was genuinely emphatic about this as the conversation progressed in a direction she found increasingly alarming, that there was any calculation involved. The alarm on her face as she understood what I was telling her was real. I knew Lily well enough to read it accurately. She had not been complicit. She had been used too, in a different way. I introduced you, she said. Her face was doing something difficult. I thought I was doing something kind. You were, I said. Your intentions were kind. What he did with them was not your doing. I'm so sorry, Grace. I know, I said. I don't hold it against you. But I need you to understand what happened and I need you to make a decision about what you do with knowing. She looked at me. What kind of decision? I told her what I was planning. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, what do you need me to do? The wedding was 6 weeks away when I found the recording. I used 4 of those 6 weeks to prepare. Ms. Reeves worked on the legal documentation, the formal preservation of the recording and the cloud folder photographs, the specific legal framework for what I intended to do, the paperwork that would need to be in place before anything public happened. I worked on the other parts. The guest list for our engagement party. We had planned a dinner for 40 people, close family and friends, 2 weeks before the wedding. I now reviewed with different eyes. These were the people who had been told Oliver's version of us for 2 years. The people who had attended our engagement dinner, who had bought us gifts, who had rearranged their calendars for our wedding. They had been participants in a fiction, and they deserved to understand what the fiction had been. I was not going to do this cruelly. That is important to me and I want to be precise about it. The people in that room had not done anything wrong. I was not going to make their discomfort the instrument of my satisfaction. What I wanted was accuracy, the specific restoration of truth to a situation that had been built on a lie, and I wanted it done with the same precision I brought to everything. Oliver's parents were invited to the engagement dinner. This was the most complicated element. His parents were, as far as I had been able to determine, genuinely unaware of what their son had planned. His mother had expressed warmth toward me that read as real. His father had made efforts to build a relationship that seemed genuine. What they had produced, raised, and sent into the world was their problem in a way that was different from their fault, and I had decided, carefully, how I was going to address them. I made a list. I checked it with Ms. Reeves. She said, ready when you are. The engagement dinner was on a Saturday in November. 40 people in a private dining room at a restaurant we had chosen together, Oliver and I. 4 months ago, back when the choosing had been a genuine shared project and not, as I now understood, a stage-managed operation with a specific endpoint he had been navigating toward. I arrived with Oliver. I was wearing the dress I had bought for this occasion, dark, clean, not the festive celebration dress the occasion nominally called for. Oliver had noticed when I came downstairs and said something complimentary that I had received with the specific smooth warmth I had been deploying for 4 weeks. Above his head, nothing unusual. He believed everything was normal. We went in. The room filled. The drinks were poured. The specific warmth of a gathering of people who are celebrating something settled over the space like a comfortable heat. I waited until everyone was seated and the first course had been served. Then I stood up. Oliver looked at me with the expression of a man who assumed his fiancé was making a toast. I want to say something, I said, before we go any further. The room settled. 40 people looking at me with the attentive warmth of people who are expecting a love declaration. I found a recording, I said. 6 weeks ago. On the laptop Oliver and I share. The quality of the room changed. Perceptibly. The way temperature changes when a window opens. I'm going to play 30 seconds of it. I want to be fair. This is not an ambush. This is information that the people in this room have a right to hear before they participate further in a wedding that would not have been what they believed it to be. Oliver's face. The specific cascade of a person understanding, very quickly, that something has gone wrong in a way they had not anticipated. I played the 30 seconds. The room was very quiet when they ended. I said, I want to be clear that this is not a story about a woman scorned. This is a story about a man who calculated the activation date of a trust fund and positioned himself deliberately to access it. Ms. Reeves, I nodded toward her, because I had invited her, which Oliver had not thought to find unusual, has the full documentation. The wedding will not be proceeding. I sat down. Oliver stood up. I looked at him with the precise calm of someone who has been preparing for this moment for 4 weeks and is ready for whatever comes next. He did several things in sequence, each of which I had anticipated. He attempted denial first, not aggressive, but present. A version of the recording being misunderstood, of the context being different from how it appeared. Above his denial, for anyone paying attention, the specific quality of a story being constructed in real time rather than remembered. His mother cut through it. This was something I had not entirely anticipated, though I had considered the possibility. His mother, whose warmth toward me had been real, I had been right about that, looked at her son across the dinner table and asked him, directly, whether what was on the recording was accurate. The pause before his answer was long enough. She nodded, once, and looked at her plate. His father said nothing for a long time. Then, "We owe Grace an apology." Oliver looked at his father. His father looked back with the expression of a man who has been presented with information about his child that requires a complete reassessment and has chosen, in real time, to begin that reassessment rather than defer it. "We do," his mother said. To me, directly. "I am sorry." I looked at them both. "I accept that," I said. "I want you both to know that what I did tonight was not directed at you." The room around these exchanges was doing the thing that rooms do when a large amount of significant information has been processed collectively, the specific quality of many people absorbing something simultaneously. Whispered conversations. The careful recalibration of what people had believed and what they were being invited to replace it with. Lily was near the end of the table. Her face was the face of someone who had been carrying the knowledge of what was coming and had brought herself to be present for it and was now working through the specific relief and difficulty of being present for it. Our eyes met. I nodded at her. She nodded back. Oliver left the restaurant before the main course. He did not come to the apartment that night. I had changed the locks that morning. Ms. Reeves had been clear about the timing, and his key no longer worked. His belongings were in boxes in the hallway that I had packed with the precise efficiency of someone who has had 4 weeks to consider how they want this moment to go. He called my phone 4 times between 10 p.m. and midnight. I let them go to voicemail. The following morning Ms. Reeves sent him the formal legal communication. The recording and documentation constituted evidence of premeditated financial fraud, the deliberate misrepresentation of his intentions in order to gain access to assets through a marriage that would not otherwise have been entered into. The specific legal framing was her area of expertise and she had constructed it with her characteristic thoroughness. The outcome she had advised him to accept was simple: departure without claims, without contest, without any attempt to access any Webb family assets or engage in any communication designed to pressure or negotiate. In exchange, the documentation would be held rather than filed. He accepted within 24 hours. His lawyer, a man I had never met whose name I learned from the formal communication, took 48 hours to respond rather than 24, which I imagined meant there had been a period of exploring whether any other path was available before concluding that it wasn't. I moved his boxes to a storage facility. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where I had sat 6 weeks before with earphones in. Outside the window the November city was doing its ordinary things. I thought, this is the same table. Everything else is different. Tom had been the professional resource. He had not, as far as Ms. Reeves's research established, been a principal in the scheme. He had provided expertise when asked rather than designing the operation himself. But he had provided it knowingly, and the legal exposure from the documentation was sufficient to make the situation professionally uncomfortable if it became known in the right circles. Ms. Reeves sent him a separate communication. Not threatening, accurate. A summary of the documentation that referenced his professional involvement and the conversations contained in the recording. A note that the documentation was being held rather than filed, and that whether it remained held was a matter of the professional decisions he made going forward. He responded through his own lawyer. He was cooperative. I had not set out to destroy anyone. I want to be clear about this. What I had set out to do was restore accuracy, to ensure that the people who had participated in Oliver's fiction understood what it had been, and to ensure that the legal and professional documentation of what he had done was complete enough to discourage any future attempt. Both of these things had been accomplished. What people did with the aftermath was their own. I went to see my father the weekend after the dinner. He had not been in the room. I had made this decision deliberately, sparing him the specific public quality of a moment that was already managing enough emotional complexity without adding a parent's grief to it. But I had called him the night before the dinner to tell him what was coming, and he had listened with the patient attention of a man who is hearing something he would have prevented if he had known how. I should have done better due diligence, he said. You introduced me to someone at a gallery opening, I said. There is a limit to what due diligence is appropriate. Not on him. On the trust. On the protections. The protections worked, I said. Nothing was taken. He was quiet for a moment. You did this by yourself, he said. The whole thing. 4 weeks of. I had Ms. Reeves, I said. That's not what I mean. I knew what he meant. He meant the 4 weeks of living in the apartment with Oliver, making dinner, watching television, performing normality while underneath the ordinary surface I had been building the case with the focused attention of someone who has decided that precision is the only appropriate response to betrayal. I was all right, I said. Were you? I thought about this honestly. I was clearer than I had been in 2 years, I said. Which isn't the same as all right. But it was something. He looked at me with the expression of a father who is proud and sad simultaneously, which is one of the more complicated expressions a face can hold. I'm sorry, he said. It's not your fault, I said. I know. I'm sorry anyway. I know, I said. Me too. We had lunch. We talked about the trust, about the activation, which was 4 months away, and about what I wanted to do with it and how I was thinking about it. He had thoughts. I had questions. It was the conversation we should have been having a year ago and were having now, which was late but not too late. That was enough. Lily called the Monday after the dinner. I answered because I had been expecting it and because I had decided, in the careful way I had been deciding things for several weeks, that the answer was worth having. I've been thinking about what to say, she said. Take your time, I said. I keep going over it, whether I should have seen something, whether there were signs I missed, whether, Lily, I said. Stop. She stopped. You introduced a friend to another friend because you thought they might get along, I said. That is not a culpable act. He used your goodwill. That is his culpability, not yours. I know, she said. Logically I know, but knowing logically and feeling it are different things, I said. Yes. A pause. Are we all right? She said. Not the social question. The real one. I thought about it. We're rebuilding, I said. That's not the same as all right and it's not the same as not all right. It's what it is. That's fair, she said. Yes, I said, it is. We made plans for coffee the following week. Neither of us performed warmth about it. It was just the next thing, honestly arrived at. That was, I was learning, the only kind of thing worth arriving at. I turned 30 in March. The activation was administrative rather than dramatic, documents signed in Mr. Webb Sr.'s offices, my father's solicitor who had turned out, under careful review, to be considerably more thorough than Oliver had assessed. The assets transferred cleanly. The management structure we had been planning for 4 months was in place. I had spent the 4 months between November and March thinking carefully about what I wanted to do. The trust was significant, not obscene. My father's conservatism had kept it proportionate to what was genuinely useful rather than what was simply large. But significant enough that what I chose to do with it mattered. I had decided, during those 4 months, on a direction. Not a dramatic one, not a public one, a specific, practical, personally meaningful one. I was going to use a portion of the trust to establish a fellowship program for analysts at early stages of their careers who were coming from educational backgrounds that had historically limited their access to the professional networks that mattered. This was my field. I had benefited from the networks. I understood what access to those networks meant and what its absence cost. I had spent 10 years seeing people with genuine analytical ability fail to access the spaces where that ability could be used properly because the spaces had gatekeepers and the gatekeepers responded to credentials that not everyone had. I had the resources to do something about a small part of this. I began doing it. I want to tell you what I kept, with the same precision I have brought to everything. The work. My analytical career, which had been mine before Oliver and remained mine after, sharpened, actually, by the 4 weeks of precise and focused attention I had brought to the documentation process. I was better at my job than I had been before. November. The specific skill of separating the signal from the noise, of identifying the pattern beneath the surface, of building a case from incomplete information. These had been my professional skills for a decade. I had applied them to my personal life once, under necessity, and found that they transferred. The fellowship program, which was 2 years in now, as I tell you this, and has moved 3 people into positions they would not otherwise have accessed, which is 3 people and also the beginning of something that compounds. Lily. Rebuilt, as I had said, different from before, more honest, more tested, more deliberately chosen. The kind of friendship that has earned its continuation. My father's trust, now mine, managed well. His conservatism, inherited and applied. Ms. Reeves, who had sent a brief message after the dust settled. Clean work on your end. She had meant the documentation process. I chose to interpret it more broadly. And the specific knowledge, not comfortable but real, of what I was capable of when I was paying attention, not as comfort, as foundation. The understanding that I could see clearly when I chose to, that I had done so once under the most difficult conditions available, and that the seeing had worked. I was 32 years old, as I tell you this. The trust was mine. The fellowship was running. The apartment, which Oliver had never contributed to financially, which I had been paying for entirely and had simply not registered because love is its own specific inattention, was mine and had always been mine and felt now, in the full sense, like it. On Tuesday mornings, sometimes, I thought about the kitchen table. I thought about the earphones and the 12 minutes and 43 seconds and the stillness afterward. I thought about everything that had been built in the 4 weeks that followed, the precision, the patience, the specific focus of someone who understands that the analytical capacity she has spent a decade developing is available to her in all areas of her life and not only the professional ones. I thought, I wish I had not needed to learn that this way. And then I thought, but I did learn it. And I kept it. That was enough. Oliver sent one message, 8 months after the dinner. Not to my personal number, he did not have it any longer. To the fellowship program's general inquiry address, which was publicly available. A brief, professional register message asking whether the program accepted applications from individuals looking to make career transitions. I read it. I considered it for a moment. Then I forwarded it to the program coordinator with a note. Standard process, no exceptions, no special handling in either direction. If he applied, he would be assessed on the same criteria as everyone else. I did not expect him to apply. The message had the quality of something sent to test whether a door was open rather than a genuine inquiry. I expected no follow-up and received none. What I thought about, for a moment after forwarding the email, was this. He had come to me looking for access to something I had. He had not found what he was looking for. What he had found, by accident, was the version of me that existed when I was paying attention. The version that documented and prepared and was precise about the difference between what was said and what was true. That version had been there all along. I had simply been looking the wrong way. I was not looking the wrong way anymore. It is a Tuesday morning in the spring of the year I turned 32. I am at my desk with the fellowship applications for the new cohort, 43 this year, up from 27 last year, and a cup of coffee and the specific pleasure of work that connects to something real. Lily is coming for dinner on Thursday. She is bringing a new person she is seeing whom she describes as surprisingly decent, which from Lily is high praise. My father called yesterday to tell me about a conference he had attended and a person he had met there who he thought I should know. He is, in his retirement, still building networks on my behalf. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it. Ms. Reeves sends a brief professional update twice a year. The documentation is held. Everything is in order. Oliver is, as far as I know, working at the same bank. I do not think about him often. When I do, it is not with anger, which would be something, a charge, an energy. It is with the specific indifference of someone who has completed an accounting and moved on from it. The fellowship's first cohort has been in their positions for 2 years now. 2 of them have been promoted. 1 is working on something I think will be significant. I chose good people. That was the work. Identifying the genuine from the performed, the real capability from the credential, the actual promise from the polished presentation. I had been learning that skill for a long time. I was good at it. This is mine. All of it.